TorahCafe.com.
In Jewish history, there is a period which is considered the missing link in Kabbalah, the dark ages of Kabbalah. And I don't mean it as it's understood in history. I mean how it's understood in Torah terms. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai passes away, his son dies. That whole generation of mystics goes the way of all humanity. And a while later, his work of Zohar disappears. It's made to disappear, it's helped to disappear, but it vanishes. It becomes not something available to the masses. And the continuing history of the Jewish people becomes almost exclusively Talmudism, the study of Talmud, the interpretation of law, and the precision in the performance of mitzvahs, as I explained earlier. But that's not entirely true. There is a record that can be traced, at least to a great degree, of a contiguous, of an uninterrupted flow of mystics, of spiritual people, of people who were pursuing the light and the soul. Even during this time that there was no Zohar, and as a consequence there wasn't that much study of mysticism. It's considered a trickle. It's not considered a very, very big river of knowledge and of scholarship. But nevertheless, there is an assumed continuity of Kabbalah from the age of Shimon Bar Yochai all the way until to the re-emergence of the Zohar and the onset of what many would be called the golden age of Kabbalah. In many works of mysticism, they will give you a list of individuals who lived during this time that were carriers of this torch. I'm just going to mention a few names, although the names may not mean that much to you, but the names mean a lot to people who know who these people were. There was Rabbi Gaon, who was from the genius, who lived over 1,000 years ago. There was, of course, Rashi and the Rashba. There was the Ravid, who was a contemporary of the Rambam, Rabbi Avraham ben David. He had a son named Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nohar, who was actually physically blind, and he was able to navigate without a walking stick because he could see spiritually. This Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nohar means blind man, had two disciples named Ezriel and Nebuziel, who wrote works of Kabbalah, who passed along to Kabbalah to the great Nachmanides, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, who will be discussed with God's help in the next segment. These were Kabbalists who studied Kabbalah, who pursued the light and the soul that we keep describing, that used the form of mysticism to access the formlessness which is behind the form, the light and the soul which is behind the body. But they didn't, at least as far as we know, have access to the Zohar. And because they did not have overt access to the Zohar, their form was quite diminished. The form and the structure of the mysticism was very limited. But for people at that time and at that level, it was sufficient form to be the basis, the conduit, the stepping stone to the light and to the soul and to the spirituality of Judaism, notwithstanding that they lacked the expansive form, which would become available when the Zohar would be rediscovered. And there were always mystics. Few, but always mystics. Now, part of our history, I mean, everybody understands that Jewish history is an incredible miracle. And one of the things about Jewish history which seems to throw us off, it disturbs us, is the non-stop fighting, or the appearance of non-stop arguing and fighting. And people say, look how political the Jews are. Unless the Gentiles were killing us, we were killing one another. That's a bit of a simplification, because those fights and those arguments may have been personal at the time, but they're the reason Torah has integrity. Jewish people always argued. And the purpose and the point and the value of all those arguing is that in the end of the day, when people argue and grind it out, and grind it out, and grind it out, what's left over, the final product is true, is a reflection of the real intent from the original author, namely God Almighty. So Jews have always been arguing and fighting. And of course, in the Middle Ages, one of the greatest arguments and fights was the interplay between the question of philosophy and the question of mysticism. You see, Kabbalah was not widely studied. It was not widely known. The Zohar did not exist. People did not have a sufficient body of knowledge to give them the sufficient form to start relating to spirituality, to godliness, to mysticism, to their soul, and so on. And instead there was philosophy. Now philosophy, as you know, is not a Jewish system of reasoning. Philosophy is a secular system of reasoning. Philosophy is like, it would be the equivalent of science today, although philosophy is not a science. And philosophy was very popular, especially amongst the Jews who lived under the Caliphate, who lived under the Muslims, who were rich and religious and quite dogmatic about it. And they had lots of philosophies. There was a huge throwback, a huge returning to the classic age of the Athenian philosophers like Aristotle and Socrates and so on, and Plato. And this enveloped, it deluged, it flooded the world. And of course, Jewish people are always at the cutting edge of new knowledge. We're also deeply steeped in philosophy. Now, philosophy is different than science because philosophy does speak about metaphysics. It speaks about spirituality, not only physical things. But philosophy is very much a science in claiming that there is no need for the imminent involvement of God in his world. Or to say it even more extremely, philosophy holds that there is a God, but that this God not only is not involved in his creation, he's not allowed to be involved in his creation, he can't even know what's going on. In other words, philosophy make God so great, they put him on such a large pedestal, that they leave us without a functioning God. We're on our own because he can't be involved in our lowly world. Now, because philosophy was so popular, it was very, very important for Jewish philosophy to address the Jewish opinion on all these questions and to deal with the fallout that philosophy brought with it in terms of agnosticism and doubt and skepticism and heresy and intellectual ambivalence and so forth. So some of our greatest rabbis, most notably Maimonides, the Rambam, and many others, wrote works of philosophy, not so much because they felt philosophy had the right answers, but because they felt that if they don't give answers to the philosophical questions that are philosophical, they're going to lose a whole generation of Jews. And this begins a whole new area in Jewish theological study and a whole new area of controversy, where in addition to the controversy of mysticism, Kabbalah per se, there is the interplay between mysticism and philosophy, which adds a whole new dimension of controversy. Philosophy and mysticism disagree on some very core issues, fundamental issues, core issues. I'll give you a number of examples. Number one, is intellect the absolute truth? Is ideas, is reason the truth? Or is reason only the reasonable truth? And there are truths beyond reason. This is a classic dispute between Kabbalah and Chakira, between philosophy and mysticism, where the philosophers would hold that God is intelligence, God is intellect. Something which is unreasonable is false and wrong because it's ungodly. God is reason. To them, God and ideas were synonyms. And the philosophers vehemently and adamantly disagreed. The mystics adamantly and vehemently disagreed because the mystics held that reason is not God. Reason is a creation of God. And God himself is not bound by the limitations of reason. So the philosophers and the mystics had a huge disagreement about whether everything in creation must make sense. Can things happen in the world that are completely beyond our comprehension? Which leads me to another area of difference and controversy between mysticism and philosophy, what is called the question of nimnois, the question of what is impossible. Which means, are there things which are impossible even for God? Are there things which God cannot do? Every child in the second grade asked the question, can God create a stone that he cannot lift? Which is essentially saying, can God create another God? Now, to the philosophers, the answer is very simple. Of course not. That's a stupid question. Stones can't be that heavy, period. In other words, if you accept the premise that reason is absolutely true, or that reason is God, anything which is illogical is false. The mystics, on the other hand, hold that logic is a creation. created by the Creator, who is not bound by the laws of logic, and therefore higher than the laws of logic. When one asks the question, can God create a stone it cannot lift, or can God create another independent being, another God? The answer has to be, why not? You can't say that he cannot do, because on a level of higher than reason, you cannot know. So this is a second example of discrepancy, of difference between philosophy and mysticism. But probably the one which is most familiar to people, and the one which is the most irksome, which leaves the most frowns, is the question of simplicity and plainness versus form. Now think about this. Jewish people, during the time of the Mishnah, during the first century, second century, simply did not study mysticism or philosophy. Mysticism was far in their past, from the time of the prophets. Philosophy was still in their future. But they were simple people. That doesn't mean they were not intelligent. They may have been incredible Talmudists, but they didn't ask the theological questions. They were not allowed to ask the theological questions. And as a consequence of this, their notions of God became very complicated, very convoluted, very distorted. When philosophy emerged, as a very, very popular part of the mainstream of intellectuals and knowledge 1,200 years ago, 1,300 years ago, 1,100 years ago, and so on, philosophers were very disturbed by the amount of anthropomorphic form that exists in mysticism. In Jewish tradition. Simple Jews read in the Bible that God has eyes and ears, and they just assumed that he has eyes and ears. And along came philosophy and really said, in effect, that this is childish, it's nonsensical, it's foolish. There's no way that Torah means that God has eyes. And therefore, philosophy worked very hard to streamline everything and to simplify everything and give us a concept of a simple God, which is true, which is important. And they, to a great degree, succeeded in giving us a notion of a simple God. And philosophy prides itself as having effectively stripped away the form that was so childish in Jewish tradition to give us a simple concept, a concept of God which is beyond fathom, beyond form, and so forth. This is what the philosophers did. Then along comes mysticism after philosophy, and of course, as you understand it, it's a reemergence of mysticism. It's an ancient mysticism reappearing on a landscape of Jewish life, where philosophy now comes first. And philosophy has worked so hard to explain to us the formless rather than the form, and reintroduces form. Mysticism, Kabbalah, is Sfiras, worlds, form. And it was a terrible problem. The philosophers had finally managed to convince the Jewish people that God doesn't have eyes. Then Kabbalah comes along and reintroduces the concept that maybe he does have eyes. Now, whatever Kabbalah means, but this was a brand new controversy. And this was a problem. It was a debate. It was an argument that was very, very deep. The philosophers were arguing plainness. The mystics were arguing that on certain levels there's a concept of form. The mystics were arguing that philosophy is a non-Torah system of reason, and the philosophers were arguing it doesn't really matter what the source of it is, as long as it has integrity, we should study it, and so on. There's so much history of controversy, of conflict, of debate between philosophy and mysticism. But this is the beginning of it. When Kabbalah reemerges against the backdrop, against a world which is steeped in philosophy, and reintroduces form, philosophy had a huge issue with it. And this is part of the conflict of our history. Philosophy makes its appearance in the absence of mysticism. Then mysticism reemerges, and mysticism makes a claim which says, in effect, we are Torah, we are the truth. Philosophy is a secular system of reason, and now that mysticism has returned, philosophy has to be thrown away. And philosophy says, excuse me, we were here through thick and thin. We were here when there was no mystical form. We're not going away simply because mysticism claims to have rights to the truth. So some Jews supported philosophy, some Jews did not support philosophy. There's so much history about the politics and the arguing and the banning and excommunicating and so on that revolves around all of these transitions from from philosophy to mysticism. And later on, the Zohar reappears. Once the Zohar reappears, this entire debate became very different. Perhaps it became redundant, mute, and almost immediately, Kabbalah's legitimacy within the world of Jewish thought was reestablished. But we'll have to get to that later, Mitzvah Hashem.